Hardy fiber cement siding is proven to withstand water, pests, and fire better than wood-based siding. And it looks better while doing it. Hardy siding has been chosen for 10 million homes and counting. See the proof at jameshardy.com.
At Kroger Pharmacy, care is what's most convenient for you. Care is being here when you need us. We're open evenings and weekends. Care is helping you save more. Most insurance plans and discount cards are accepted at your local Kroger Pharmacy. Care is saving you time by managing your prescriptions online. You can request refills, check order status, and more. Care is convenience that works for everyone. Kroger Health, a world of care is in store. Services and availability vary by location. Age and other restrictions may apply. For coverage, consult your health insurance company. Visit the pharmacy or our site for details.
The 3 Down Greencast is brought to you by the Pile of Bones Brewing Company, Regina's only downtown brewery. Well, this is a little different for me this week, as John is away being a big slacker and pretending to take time off or something. I don't know. I guess it was nice enough to give him some time after one of the worst Rider performances in recent history. So this should be a really fun podcast, but it's also probably going to be our most credible podcast ever because I am joined by my good friend, CJME Green Zone's Arielle Zerr, who has been kind enough to lend her time this evening as we record this podcast to share her thoughts on that dumpster fire of a game and kind of the Riders and the state of the league in general. Thanks.
Yeah, dumpster fire is kind of the word of the day, I would say, because I remember we actually got a text in on the CJME text line before the game saying, stop comparing me to a dumpster fire, signed to the Montreal Alouettes. But now it seems like maybe that's the Rough Riders that should be saying that, or they could be saying about that, because it was an ugly one. Absolutely, and there was no other way to describe what happened in that game. I remember I actually texted Drew, the guy who runs the site, after the game, and I said, "Is tire fire one word or two?" I wanted to make sure CP Style I got that right, yeah. And he told me it was 2 words, and then he had some other descriptions that he used as well that I probably shouldn't really share on this podcast, so we won't. But as you've learned, as is tradition on the 3 Down Greencast, we open a beer and chat a little bit. So, Arielle, what are you enjoying this week? Today I am enjoying the Muskoka Brewery's Summer Weiss, a tropical wheat, which is, I love wheat beers. Yeah. Like Hefeweizens are like my jam. And Joel, you picked really, really well for me this week because this thing is this is delicious. You're right, a little bit radlery. It's got a nice tropical. It's the perfect summer beer, really. It's fantastic. Yeah. I'm really, really liking it. What do you got today?
And for me, it's the 3rd week in a row it's made an appearance on the show. It's the Pile of Bones White IPA. I mean, it makes sense.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show, actually official sponsors of the show as well. So thanks to Glenn and the guys again for doing that, as we made that little announcement last week. Not that anyone really cares who sponsors the show, but
we like beer.
We like beer, and it makes us look somewhat legitimate that we have a sponsor. So it's like, hey, these guys must be onto something when we're not. So we have a lot to get to in this show. We're going to talk a lot about Duron Carter because that's obviously the big conversation around here. We're going to talk about the quarterbacks. We'll look ahead to kind of the game a little bit this week, what we should expect to see against Hamilton or what should be different. It might not be, but should be. And, we'll maybe touch on a few other little topics from across the league as well, though, because John and I generally like to talk about one kind of big story in the CFL this week, but I think the Riders were the big story in the CFL this week, so it might be hard to touch on something else. Maybe we can talk about Kyries Heber a little bit and
maybe
his
Matt
buffoonery.
Nichols as well.
Matt Nichols, yeah, that just came down today, so that'll be an interesting conversation as well. So when we're talking about the game, there's going to be a lot of negative coming through here in the next little bit. So I want to make sure we give this the time first. What was really the most important part of that game on Saturday night was the Humboldt Strong, the ceremony, everything involved that happened that evening, and just the top-notch job the Riders did on that.
And the Rough Riders are really great at this kind of thing, really. They've shown us over the years how classy they are in these types of situations. I'm thinking Darian Durant's return last year. The video that they prepared for him was really quite touching, and they did it again. And it wasn't just the video, which was wonderful and well done, but there were so many little touches along the way. There was the white ribbon at the 29-yard line in remembrance of the 29 people in the bus crash. There was having the players and their families there, of course. There was the scholarship that they created for Dana Bronze, the athletic therapist, that they're going to give out every year to a student therapist that helps them out during training camp. So many wonderful little things. I loved that they flipped a puck.
Absolutely. That was really fun. Yeah.
Instead of a coin with the Humboldt Broncos logo on it. I thought that was amazing. And them bringing in the merchandise to help Humboldt save it. There was so many things that the Rough Riders did right in that game, and that's only just a few of them.
Yeah, absolutely. There was so much more, and I pointed that out, and like I felt on 3 Down Nation, I had to write a separate piece on that rather than putting those thoughts in with my game thoughts, because that would be unfair to everything that the Riders did for Humboldt Strong that night. And like you said, and I agree with you completely, it was the little things that really made the difference when they unraveled the 13th man flag and the Humboldt Strong ribbon was on there, and the Stars ambulance flyover instead of, the usual jet planes that we would see for a flyover, right? So just little things like that, and the whole night was just really well done. It's too bad the game didn't live up to any of that, because I kind of thought the players would feed off it a little bit, but nonetheless, they did all of that stuff right, as they always do, and you just have to give them a round of applause for it.
And something that they couldn't control, but was really, I think, almost the highlight of the night for me, was there was actually a rainbow over that appeared over Mosaic Stadium, almost a hello, I want to say, from all of the people that died, saying, we see you, and it was a night about remembering, and for so many people, rainbows are a symbol of that, and I thought that, that's not something that the Rough Riders could control, but I thought it was such a beautiful happenstance that it happened that way. And speaking of beautiful things that the Rough Riders can't control, whether or not Naaman Roosevelt gets fined for this, but he wore special Humboldt Strong cleats. He spray painted them green and yellow. On one foot he had Humboldt Strong in gold letters, and the other one he had the crest of the Humboldt Broncos. He said he'd been thinking about what he could do for a really long time, that the whole situation really affected him, and that was just a small thing, but I think a small thing, like all of the other small things that add up to a really big thing done really well.
Absolutely. And so the Riders did well on that. It was not fun to watch, that's not the right word, but
it was very touching.
It was very touching. It was well done, and it was worth watching, and I'm sure long term that's what everyone will remember about that night. The football game was atrocious and atrocity to the game, but everything else is really what people will remember, because football games fade, bad games happen, but this is going to live on for a long time, and the Riders, I know they've said it, and there's no reason not to believe them, that they're not done with this. Like, they are going to continue to be there for the Broncos, for Humboldt, and everyone affected by this.
And this was an opportunity really for the first time for the people of Saskatchewan to acknowledge the families in a public way like this. This was really, I think, very special for the people who came to the game to be able to, through a standing ovation, basically, and the crowd was on their feet through pretty much the whole pregame ceremony, to be able to tell the families in their own way, in a way that only Saskatchewan people can, that we're here with you, our arms are wrapped around you, and we're going to support you through all of this. And when I talked to Eddie Steele, who had spent time in Humboldt before the tragedy happened, and then of course went back after, he said that was what he was most looking forward to, is he knew that the people of Saskatchewan had been waiting for this opportunity, and they didn't disappoint either. We're all behind the Humboldt Broncos, and we're all Humboldt Strong. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, this, as much as there's been lots of memorials and a lot happening in this province for it, the Riders are still this province's biggest stage.
Yes.
So it was the moment everyone kind of been waiting for. You don't really want to make the home opener of that, because it's a different thing. So I understand why the Riders waited to their second home game. And to the little point to add to everyone being on board, even the bunch of us old curmudgeons in the press box are wearing our pins that they gave to us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Even Herb Zurkowski, one of the most
curmudgeonly of all.
And we can talk about Herb a little bit later too, maybe, but we'll see. Anyway, there's no real way to transition out of this, so we're just gonna say that's kind of the close of the Humboldt Strong discussion, and now let's get into the fun stuff. So as you all know by now, the Riders were throttled, in a sense, by the Montreal Alouettes. The fact that they weren't throttled score-wise was because they played the Montreal Alouettes. I think if they played any other team that night besides maybe Toronto, they would have lost they would have been down 30 at halftime.
Absolutely, and it's in large part to do with the fact that the Montreal Alouettes are in the same position as the Rough Riders are in right now, in the sense that they don't have a quarterback that can really be effective.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that Brandon Bridge doesn't have the potential to get there, but he's not there yet. And we all know, as we've seen through the years, that Drew Willy is not a starting quarterback in the CFL.
No.
He's a contingency plan. He's not the plan. And the fact that the Montreal Alouettes had to go with him kind of says something about where the organization is at right now. And I think one of the only positives that you can take out of this game for the Rough Riders was the defensive line. They were back to form, the way we're used to seeing them after being completely stymied by the Ottawa Red Blacks. Willie Jefferson came back, did Willie Jefferson, all the things we expect Willie Jefferson to do. I mean, 2 sacks, forced fumble, knockdowns at the line. This is Willie Jefferson. He is a specimen on the field.
It was 2 weeks ago on this show. I called him my man crush of the CFL.
He's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and what we don't talk about maybe enough, the fact that he's just vicious on the field. Off the field, he's this very dynamic, charismatic leader. He's the person that the team all kind of turns to. He's the leader on the defense, and the team really rallies around him. But he's got this. He's also got this I don't want to say he's got a big softie, but he does have a soft heart, and he just had a daughter in the off season, and he's very caring. He's very thoughtful.
That's true of a lot of the big guys.
Yeah, the ones you don't think.
It's the offensive line, the defensive line. These guys that just do nasty things to each other for 60 minutes of football just end up being some of the nicest guys you ever meet too.
And
It's a weird dynamic, but it's how it is.
It is, and Willie wears a grill on his teeth, and he's got the tattoos on his body, and you think he might be a certain way, and he's the complete opposite. But he is that way that you think he is on the football field.
100%, yeah.
And it was nice to see the defensive line back in form. I thought Zach Evans probably had his best game as a Rough Rider. He's kind of finding his magic again. And Charleston Hughes, the fact that you have Charleston Hughes on one end of the defensive line and you have Willie Jefferson on the other strikes fear into the hearts of quarterbacks across the league. And hopefully they can strike a little fear into Jeremiah Mazzoli.
Well, we'll get into this week's game in a little bit, but that's probably going to be their only chance to win this game, I think. So for what went right defensively, because overall the defense did play fairly well, and it's the only reason they kept them in that game. There was the one glaring problem on defense that has been the talk of this province since about halftime of that game.
Talk of the league, really.
Talk of the league, absolutely, because as I wrote about last year on 3 Down Nation, that everyone has an opinion on Duron Carter. So when stuff like this happens to him, everyone shares their opinion on Duron Carter. And that's good for the league, but in this scenario, that decision that Chris Jones made to put him at defensive back with no backup, I think it's fair to say that essentially cost them the football game.
I think that the lack of offense probably also didn't help, but 2 really big explosions for Duron Carter, 2 penalties, 130 yards Chris Williams got off of him, and I don't understand why Duron Carter is a defensive back for a number of reasons. The biggest being that he is one of your greatest offensive weapons, and you're taking it away from first Zach Collaros, a quarterback still learning your offense and trying to feel comfortable, and now Brandon Bridge or David Watford, who are a lot newer to the game and could use an offensive weapon like Duron Carter. But if you're Chris Jones and you've decided, hey, Duron Carter is a defensive back, that's it. Why, oh why, Joel, are they putting him in the most exposed position on the football field? Why not put him on the other side, the wide side, not the wide side, the other side of the ball.
We know what you meant, yeah.
But, and not where he's not facing the Deontay Spencers, he's not facing the Chris Williams. Leave that to Ed Gainey and the guys who have been shown to be able to do that, and put your rookie DB, because for all intents and purposes, at this position, Duron Carter is a rookie, 100%. Put him on the other side of the ball where he might not see quite as much action.
Yeah, I think that decision makes sense, or at the very least you have to float him around to find, okay, where's the weakest receiver on the field? Duron, that's where you're going. And whoever they tag a few guys and they say, okay, if number 12 gets on the field, you're going there. And you just move around based on that. And I'm like, just for the life of me, the whole roster, there's so many issues with it. And even if, let's say, hypothetically, Duron Carter was a good defensive back, there was still nothing protecting them if someone went down. They were still screwed either way. So because there was no defensive back number one, given the way the game went in the situation, they couldn't yank Duron off the field.
Right. He
had to keep playing. And so that was an issue. And they clearly didn't have it. There was clearly roster issues with that game. And
well, what you saw, too, was, and you saw it especially, I think, in the later part of the game, was Ed Gainey having not only to watch his receiver, but to back up Duron Carter. I think
I saw that like very early in the game, too. It was Montreal's first big play. And I think Duron got confused on who he's covering, where he's going. So all of a sudden, I don't remember who the Alouettes receiver was, ran by him. All of a sudden, Gainey's between the two of them, and he has to pick one. And of course, Drew Willie's not good, but he still recognized that situation and saw the guy 50 yards open downfield. So, yeah, of course. And that led to 3 points on the board. That one play right away. And I was like, oh boy, here we go. And it went. And the truly amazing thing was that the Alouettes didn't throw anything special at Duron Carter.
Nope.
It was a simple, straightforward, the same go route every time.
Yep.
And he just couldn't do it. He tried to bump, he couldn't. He tried giving Chris Williams like a 10-yard cushion, he still couldn't catch him.
Yep.
So nothing in that scenario was working, and it all comes down to coaching decisions.
And credit to Duron Carter. I mean, I don't think that he's an ineffective defensive back, but he's not as fast as Chris Williams. No. And you do have to give some credit to Chris Williams for being as quick and as good as he is. But when you recognize that your defensive back is being beat, you have to change something. Mm-hmm. And that's coaching. That's not Duron Carter. That's coaching. That's someone that needs to make a decision and move things around and tweak it. Because I also don't think, like, as far as confidence goes, as far as as far as Duron Carter, he's not a fragile person. He's not he's not an egotistical person necessarily either. But he wants to be good.
Yeah.
Right? He wants to be good. And right now, he's not good.
No, and as you said, like during this conversation and everything I've said about this to date, this isn't a shot at Duron.
No.
This is about coaching, because coaching is putting your best players in their best spot to give your team the best chance to win. And Chris Jones simply didn't do that in that football game, because between the defensive backs, between essentially Eddie Steele's on the roster to back up the offensive line because they have no one else. And then there's the idea of Jerome Messam, and they want to put him on a pitch count, which I get, but they have to keep him on the roster because they have no Canadians. So it's
a mess.
It's making a roster in the CFL isn't really that difficult once you have the players. Your depth chart is pretty straightforward for the most part. And so they were missing a backup DB. They didn't really have a backup offensive lineman. But hey, at least they had 16 linebackers and defensive linemen on the roster for some reason.
Well, and never mind that the linebackers that they have were not the linebackers that could go on the Sam linebacker position, was essentially another defensive back position. It's the position that Derek Moncrief plays. But all of those linebackers are either middle linebackers or wide side linebackers, will linebackers.
Or Sam Hurl, who can't really do either.
Right, yeah. I mean, so Sam Hurl, to his credit, had the most tackles in that game. There was 7 of them. And the run game by the Alouettes was fairly insignificant as far as the game went. But that being said, they don't have the support where they need the support. I mean, Derek Moncrief would be a guy, if you had someone that was backing up Derek Moncrief, that could perhaps fill in at defensive back for you. And this is the real concern, is what if Creston Butler goes down in the next game? Then what do the Rough Riders do? Because Duron Carter is the backup DB, and they don't have anyone else. So all of a sudden you're moving Mike Edom? Are you flipping Neiman Roosevelt? I mean...
Well, you might as well not play any receivers, I guess. Let's put them all at DB.
We saw Christian Jones taking reps as defensive back this week. He's the returner. Chris Jones is not inclined to have his returners do anything else other than return it. He said today, it was kind of in his experience, that the more you put on your returner's plate, the less dynamic they are as your returner. And Christian Jones is a dynamic returner, 100%. So I understand that logic. But the idea that they're putting him in the lineup, and he says he feels comfortable putting him in if he needs to, is a sign to me that, maybe he's thinking at least a little more long-term about what solutions can be. Christian Jones played some DB at Alabama. He's no slouch at that position, certainly. No. And he's a very talented receiver as well that they could use in a pinch. So at least we're seeing a little bit of options. They also brought in Matt Elam for all of his legal troubles. You can go to Wikipedia, look up Matt Elam on Wikipedia and see the entire heading that says legal troubles. He is a defensive back, so yay?
Well, I mean, we'll have to see, but it's mind-boggling to me that the scouting staff this team allegedly has, and the amount of work that they do scouting, that by the end of training camp, they thought none of these DBs were good enough. All this work they've done, allegedly. I don't know what they actually do at these camps, if anyone's actually paying attention, but it's just, like...
There's thousands of DBs out there. There's thousands of DBs cut from the NFL. There's thousands of DBs that don't get drafted into the NFL. Mm-hmm. And Chris Jones is a defensive genius, but his defensive backs play man coverage. So really, it's not that difficult in the short term if you need to slide a defensive back in to play man coverage. Javon Johnson, I mean, he's been in the league for a while, but Javon Johnson had 3 days on the Rough Rider defense before they put him into the game, and he was perfectly fine. It's not rocket science to find a defensive back.
I would rather have a guy who has at least played this position basically his entire life, even if he's brand new to the league, do that than try to flip a guy to the other side of the field. I think the chances are at least moderately better that he's not going to look like a goof out there. He's not going to cost you the football game at the very least.
And this is there's a lot of changes. When you're a receiver your entire life, and Duron Carter kind of put it as a defensive back, your job is to get beat, in a sense, is kind of what he said. And as a and that's not necessarily true, but when you listen to the second part of the quote, it kind of makes sense in the way that he's saying it. He said, as a defensive back, it's kind of your job to get beat. And as a receiver, it's your job to do the beating. And Duron Carter is very good at beating defensive backs. And it is a completely different mentality to have to think about what the receiver is going to do, think about where your eyes are going, thinking about the next steps that receiver that you're following may take. It completely changes things for you. And why, when Duron Carter is one of the most talented receivers in the league, would you want to change that?
That's the $64,000 question that no one really has the answer to. And so what this is the double-edged sword of what they're doing with Duron is the offense hasn't been good at all this year. And now they take their best, arguably, at least their most explosive weapon out of the game, because he's the guy that makes big plays. Naaman's the steady guy who's, the go-to when you need a first down. But
he's going to grind it out for you.
Yeah, but Duron adds that splash. He adds the big play when you need a spark. Looks to me like they're an offense that could use a spark right now. So that's what really drives home the situation is, okay, he's not good at defensive back right now, and he's not helping the offense either. So really, what's the whole point of this whole thing? Because the offense, let's face it, the offense might be the worst in the CFL right now. They have 3 offensive touchdowns in 3 games.
And that's what I said in that game against the Alouettes, is if the Rough Riders are going to win that game, it's the defense that's going to have to score for them, because the offense isn't going anywhere.
No.
And that's the problem. And the thing that drives me, absolutely crazy is, yes, and one of the reasons Chris Jones said that he could put Duron Carter on in his defensive back is that Shaq Evans, the rookie, he's number 1. He is so good that allows them to be able to flip Duron Carter. But hey, in your struggling offense, if Shaq Evans is so good, here's an idea. Why aren't we playing Duron Carter, Shaq Evans, Naaman Roosevelt, Caleb Hawley, and Joshua Stanford?
Yeah.
Why aren't we playing our 5 best receivers then if the Rough Riders and the offense have no ability to score touchdowns right now? Why aren't you putting in all of your top playmakers? The defense is good. Mm-hmm. They can't do it all.
No. Not at this stage anyway. They need some kind of support, even if it's just eating some clock and helping field position a little bit, and they can't even do that right now. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that really has to do with the sad state of affairs that is the offensive line. Like, let's face it, we can talk about who they're missing on offense, the Caleros injury, Carter not being there. All that's bad, and it's not helping them, but everything, I don't care. You could have Aaron Rodgers in there right now, and this offense would probably be going nowhere because they just have no time. 0 time whatsoever, and they finally signed a guy this week. We'll see if that ever makes a difference, but I mean, I don't know. I'm honestly kind of surprised at this point, unless there has been and he said no. I'm surprised there hasn't been a call to Pete Diakowski.
And I've been saying that for weeks now. Yeah. Like, at what point are we calling Peter Diakowski back? Because that offensive line was much, much stronger. with Peter Diakowski in that right guard position. Yeah. And I understand that he's Canadian, he's been in the league for a while, he's expensive, and I'm sure that that's part of the reason why the Rough Riders let him go, also because they signed Bond.
Yeah.
And they thought he was going to be the answer, and clearly he wasn't.
And then he goes to Edmonton, and it's been okay.
Yeah, he's been fine. And the thing is like, they want Bladek to be the answer.
Yeah.
And I think he is.
I think he can get there, 100%.
But he's not quite there yet.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of problems with that spot, really, for the Rough Riders all through the season. It's kind of the leaky faucet right now for the offensive line, no matter who they put in there. Jarvis Harrison certainly wasn't doing anyone any favors, arguably. Part of the reason Zach Collaros is concussed is that failure, but...
yeah, I mean, it was the right side, because Thaddeus Coleman had a rough game in that one too. He seemed to get beat all the time. I mean, Dan Clark, he's okay. He's an average center. I don't think there's anything special about him. I'm starting to wonder about Brendan Labatt a little bit. I don't think he's at the level he once was. And I know my companion on 3 Down Nation, Josh Smith, took a lot of heat for saying that maybe he shouldn't be in the top 50 of the CFL this year. Based on his performance so far this year, I'd be like, yeah, Josh might be right on that one. Like, really he's still a good offensive lineman, but I don't think he's not what we used to see out of Brendan Labatt.
You know, it was really interesting when Brendan Labatt was named. He was voted the Rough Riders Offensive Lineman of the Year last year.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting that when that happened, to see almost... Not that the offensive line didn't think that Brendan Labatt was a good offensive lineman, but a lot of them felt it should have been Thaddeus Coleman. That Thaddeus Coleman is a bit of an unsung hero on the offensive line. You said he got beat pretty bad in Ottawa, but he's been a pretty solid right tackle for the Rough Riders. The fact is that there might be some people listening right now that don't even really know the name Thaddeus Coleman, and that is a good thing, in the sense that if you don't know these guys' names, it means they're probably doing their job. And he did have that bad game against Ottawa, but I think he's been probably one of the strongest offensive linemen that the Rough Riders have had. They had a good O-line last year, so I don't know why they...
It started off rough.
But I don't know why they decided they were they needed to tweak it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, the chain, when they moved positions around, and there was the few games where Dan Clark was out and Labatt was in the middle, and they moved Dennis inside, and they switched, that's when the offensive line turned. They don't have that kind of personnel move inside them this year. They're pretty much stuck with what they got, frankly. There isn't really anything else on the roster unless this new guy suddenly becomes something. But I mean, he was cut in Hamilton, so I don't know.
But he is young. I mean, he was cut in Hamilton. He was a 13th overall draft pick in 2017. I mean, he was 2 picks below Dariusz Bladek in that draft. I don't know what it was that Hamilton decided he wasn't worth the possible potential that he could have at that point. You know, that's what I'm really not sure about. But I mean, he's certainly got the size, 6'4", I think 312 pounds. And if the Riders feel like he can be an answer for them, and it gets your backup O-lineman to be, say, him as opposed to Eddie Steele.
As opposed to a defensive lineman, yeah.
But though Eddie Steele, that's an interesting case too, because Chris Jones said part of the reason that he's a backup O-lineman is because they signed Mikhail Brooks, and there's less reps in the defensive interior now. And I think part of the reason that they signed Mikhail Brooks was they weren't happy with the pressure they were getting up the middle against Ottawa, and part of that was, I think, they weren't happy with how Zach Evans played in that game. The whole defensive line didn't play very well in that game, but Zach Evans has bounced back beautifully. And so I'm not saying that they shouldn't have signed Mikhail Brooks. I'm just saying I don't know if it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. / Chris Jones has a tendency to just sign good defensive players, or what he perceives as good defensive players, when they become available.
Yeah, and so the other question offensively right now for this football team is the quarterback position, which is an ongoing conversation in this province since about the midpoint of 2014. And there was the decision that Chris Jones made that was kind of Corey Chamberlain-esque, where he yanked Brandon Bridge at halftime because the offense wasn't doing anything. David Watford came in, had a few sparks more than Brandon Bridge did. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty at the end of the day, both players had essentially the same numbers at the end of the day. So to me, it was just too soon. We were talking about this before we started recording, and this isn't last year where there was 2 very different quarterbacks in Kevin Glenn and Brandon Bridge. this is a scenario where both quarterbacks are essentially the same, so what difference is changing going to make?
And part of the reason that Brandon Bridge was so successful, I felt, coming in relief in Kevin Glenn, was that he had Kevin Glenn. And Kevin Glenn was willing to support Brandon Bridge and was there over his shoulder, helping him the whole way, showing Brandon what he was seeing, and really mentoring Brandon through the whole process. He doesn't have, and Brandon Bridge isn't that person for David Watford, whether he wants to be or not. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
Kevin Glenn is Kevin Glenn, and he helped Brandon be the quarterback that he was last year. I'm not saying that Brandon can't be a good quarterback on his own. I think he has the potential, but I think part of the problem with pulling him from that game, and Chris Jones's notion that he may continue to do that if Brandon Bridge continues to struggle, is how is Brandon Bridge ever going to learn and develop if he doesn't have to try to fight through some of these issues, and when he digs himself a hole trying to get himself out of it. I thought it was way too soon for Chris Jones to pull the plug on Brandon Bridge. I thought they should have given him a bit of an opportunity, or if they wanted to put David Watford in at a limited number of reps to let Brandon kind of see what was going on and then put him back in and see if he's effective again. I mean, I think he earned the opportunity to try to dig himself out of it, but that's not Chris Jones's style. It's almost like he panics because this is what, and figures because it worked with Kevin Glenn, it may now work with Brandon Bridge, but it's not the same.
No, it's not the same at all. And if you're in a scenario right now where you do expect Zach Collaros to be back at some point, so you got to let your guys work through this. There's no other options. There's no
magic quarterback.
Kerry Joseph isn't walking through that door,
Yeah.
So you have to let your young guys work through these scenarios. You see it in all sports all the times, where coaches who let their young players make mistakes and learn from them eventually become better players because of that. And if you don't give, in a number, more importantly than anything, this essentially shows that Chris Jones just essentially has no faith that if Brandon Bridge is playing poorly, he can't turn it around.
And what does that say to your quarterback?
Yeah.
If they don't feel like they have the confidence in you? I mean, to Chris Jones's credit, he went back out on Tuesday morning or Monday morning and he said Brandon Bridge is our starter. But he also couched that by saying if he struggles, David Watford's going to go in. And I've never really understood. I think you've seen across the league the benefit that it gives your starting quarterback to know they're the guy, and they're the guy no matter what.
Even if he's thinking, okay, if things go sideways, I'm going to put David Watford in, you don't come out and say it. As much as I appreciate the honesty, and I always will, you don't come out and say it in that scenario.
I just don't think so. I think that you're playing with the psyche of a quarterback that's already obviously struggling a little bit with their confidence. And I think Marshall Ferguson, TSN's Marshall Ferguson, had a really good point on Twitter not that long ago. He was talking about both Jeremiah Masoli and Brandon Bridge, and he feels like they are kind of on the same trajectory. But the difference is that June Jones committed to Jeremiah Masoli, let him make his mistakes, and let him learn from them. And now look at what Jeremiah Masoli is. And Brandon Bridge maybe has that potential, but we don't know unless he gets the opportunity to work through his kinks and work through his mistakes and perhaps reach the potential that I think that he has. Yeah.
And really, ultimately, again, everything as it seems to right now comes back to Duron Carter. Because the idea is one of Brandon Bridge's biggest flaws is his accuracy. And it was Derek Taylor of TSN last year who would love to make the point that there was no quarterback in the league that was helped up more by his receivers than Brandon Bridge. So we know Naaman Roosevelt can go up and make the catches. Yeah. He's not afraid to do something dangerous to make a catch. And we know that Duron Carter can make circus catches. The other guys, we don't really know that much about them yet. At this point, it's proving what we saw in that game looked like they're not ready to adapt to Brandon Bridge's sort of lack of accuracy. He's got a cannon of an arm, but the ball's not always in the right spot, and the young receivers aren't ready for that yet.
And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the reasons that Chris Jones said that he cut the likes of Chad Owens, Bakari Grant, and Rob Bagg was that accuracy reason, and he wanted to have the young guys would be able to kind of veer off course a little bit, get to the ball a little bit faster, make those catches. But I think what we saw last year was that there was already an established quarterback. I'm not saying we're going to go back in time and not cut Rob Bagg or Chad Owens or Bakari Grant. That that boat has sailed.
Yeah.
And this is the Rough Rider team that exists right now. Yeah. But you are replacing veterans with rookies. And I do wonder if that was the smartest decision that the Rough Riders could have made, given you were bringing in a quarterback who is not 100% familiar yet with your offense in Zach Collaros.
And was in all likelihood going to get injured at some point. And so you were forced to put in your young, inaccurate quarterbacks.
Exactly. So why not have at least one, if not two of the guys who are familiar with your offense had good seasons in limited time in Chad Owens' cases, but Chad Owens' case, time in your offense, understood it, and would be able to be there to help out your quarterback. I remember in the 2016 season, not that we really want to go back to that one, but talking to some of the young quarterbacks that the Rough Riders brought in that year, and you know how many of them said Rob Bagg was the biggest help to them that season?
Oh, they all do.
They all do. Naaman Roosevelt, Rob Bagg is one of his biggest helps when he came here too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And there's something to be said about losing that guy who's been around the block and is that mentor to everyone else, and is also the mentor to your young quarterback.
Yeah, and I don't really know what happened with Rob Bagg. I don't think production-wise we were too surprised. There's been we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I think the Chad Owens thing, there was an injury there, so I wonder if there was an opportunity to at least stash him on the 6 games so he's around.
Because he did that last.
Because Eric, you could have done the old Eric Tillman and put him on the 6 game for a while and see what happens. And if it's right now, it would be like, okay, yeah, I guess we need Chad Owens. We're going to activate him, right?
Yeah.
So that could have been a scenario that they could have looked at, but there, as we've seen, with Canadian drafts, with a lot of the young Americans they bring in, there's generally a lack of foresight with how this team has been built over the years under Chris Jones.
And so, as you're saying, you're right. This all comes back to receivers. This all comes back. The offensive struggles come back to not having the guys, and if you that are able to make the big plays. And if you take Duron Carter out of that as well, what are you left with? An offense that only scores 3 touchdowns in 3 games. Yeah,
and the other sort of question people had about the offense was, why weren't they using Joel Gasson? So you were the one that got to ask the question.
Basically, Chris Jones said he's 33 years old, and I want to have him for the end of the season. Well, okay, I suppose, but at this rate, you're not going to have an end of the season. Matter, so it's interesting because we were under the understanding as the media that Jerome Messam wasn't going to get a pitch count in the regular season, that the pitch count was really only for training camp. He was trying to limit his reps so that he'd be fresh for the regular season.
Which makes sense, yeah.
He had a pretty solid game against Toronto, including kind of closing that game out for them, just kind of pounding downfield to get that final field goal to seal that home opener. And then we saw a lot less of Jerome Messam as it went on, and it's not without its frustration for Jerome. I think I described him as diplomatically frustrated, in the sense that he admits that he's frustrated and he's disappointed that he's not playing, but he also is trying to be understanding. He wants to help his teammates. It's a situation though that he's never found himself in before. He's always been the guy, and for the last 2 seasons, he's been the 1,000-yard guy too, right? So even at 31 and 32, he wasn't tapering off, and I think especially when you watch those running backs struggle in that game against the Alouettes, why not put in a 6'3", 200-pound body that could just crash through some guys and just see what happens? This is another problem with the Rough Rider offense, and this is another thing that's not helping Brandon Bridge or Zach Collaros, whoever's behind center.
Or the protection.
They can't get the run game going.
No, but the problem, this is an issue I've had with Steve McAdoo's offense forever, is it seems if on the first few runs it doesn't look like it's working, he just gives up. And we've seen it time and time again, and for this team right now that is a revolving door of an offensive line, we saw in the first game where they didn't put up huge yards, but they actually committed to the run game. And John and I talked about this because when the offensive line gets into that mode of the run game, it gives them a different attitude. It allows them to attack rather than having to react.
Yeah.
And that's such a difference in the mind of the offensive lineman, not just for run plays, but for the entire game, knowing that they get to have some fun and actually mash some guys. And that's the thing. And they're not getting that right now because, okay, well, the first 2 runs didn't work, so let's just throw the football for the rest of the night.
And I think people underestimate how much pride. I mean, as much as they feel bad, an offensive line feels bad when their quarterback takes a sack. The pride on the flip side of it that they take in a good run game.
100%.
How proud they feel when their running back runs for 100 yards, or that they have a solid run game. Those offensive linemen are almost happier, I would say, than the running back to have a game like that, because they love the run game, because that, like you said,
that's the fun part of the job.
That they get to be aggressive. They get to push back. They don't have to be on the defensive all the time trying to protect. They get to make the space and make the room.
Yeah. It creates a mojo. It creates a move forward momentum for the offensive line that then carries into the protection. And Steve, I just don't know if Steve McAdoo doesn't get that, or what his deal is when it comes to the run game, frankly. But I mean, yeah.
And I feel like the Rough Riders run game hasn't been great for a long time. I mean, I feel like the most consistent it was when Cam Marshall was the running back.
Yep.
And he wasn't putting up astronomical numbers in any sense, but he was a very solid, serviceable running back that got you the yards that you needed to. And on the flip side of that, had a very keen instinct to pick up the block when it was necessary.
Yep.
And I think that that's another thing that maybe some of these running backs aren't doing as well. And Marcus Thigpen talked about this, is the blocking isn't quite there as well. And he said that Marcus Thigpen said Chris Jones talked to him about that. He said, if you want to go from a good running back to a great running back, you better start blocking, boy, because it's not getting it done right now. And Chris Jones values that in a running back more than anything else.
Yep.
He couldn't care. Well, I shouldn't say he couldn't care less if he runs for 1,000 yards.
I'm sure
he
would love to have one.
That.
Yeah.
But he really, really wants that extra quarterback protection, and he feels like it's the running back's responsibility to do that.
Yeah, and I mean there are other options to do that. We've seen it in the past when Dan Clark was a tight end.
And Darius Bladex played that position.
He's done a little bit.
Spencer Moore
goes up
that
there
position sometimes.
So there is always the option to go max protect, and it'll be interesting to see if they do that a little more against Hamilton this week as we shift a little bit and we talk about the game ahead. They've announced that Brandon Bridge is going to start, as we talked about, but David Watford will probably make an appearance at some point or another. So what do you think? What do you think needs to happen in this game for the Rough Riders to get back on track?
They need to shake Jeremiah Mazzoli early. They just need to get up in his grill. I think that that's really going to be the key, because I don't know if the Rough Riders have the offense to be able to outscore them with Jeremiah Mazzoli playing at the level that he's at right now. Brandon Bridge said he's playing at a godlike level right now, and I'd be hard to press to disagree with that.
It's early, but there's been a few MOP whispers starting already.
For sure. I mean,
right?
I think what is he? That was his 8th straight 300-plus game. This week he could go to tie the record at 9. He's playing exceptionally well. And so if the Rough Riders can't figure out a way to slow down the Hamilton Tiger Cat offense and slow down Jeremiah Mazzoli, I don't think that they stand a chance, because I just don't think that they're going to be able to put up the yards that they need in order to be able to surpass them if they can't slow him down.
No, not at all. Unless the Hamilton defense has like a historically bad night. Because I mean, there is every time people like us break down games, and what do you expect? There's always the
intangible.
But, because anything could ever happen in any football game. You never know, right? But ultimately, the offense, in all likelihood, isn't going to be able to win in this football game. And I think you're going to have to, frankly, and especially if they're going to keep Duron Carter at DB, because no one else is ready yet on a short week, which I somewhat get that.
Yeah.
Well, then if you're stuck with Carter back there, and you know that June Jones is going to try to get Brandon Banks on him, because he's seen what Deontay Spencer and what Chris Williams did to him, then I think you're going to have to see a lot of blitzing in this game. I know Chris Jones likes to get his pressure with just his 4 down men or his 3 down men sometimes, but you don't have an option in this case, because you have maybe a second or two until someone's open on Duron Carter. You better be sending, like, maybe not all, 4, and then you need to send a linebacker or a DB or someone from somewhere on probably 75% of downs.
Yeah, and I think that's something Chris Jones has said that pressure is going to be kind of key in this game. I think he's recognized that as well. It also seems like the defensive backs are playing more of a specific man coverage as opposed to a man-to-man coverage. That was kind of the impression that I got early in the week. We'll see if that holds. But that might mean that someone that's not named Duron Carter may be assigned to cover Brandon Banks. We'll see how that actually pans out. But I think the defensive line has to have a game like they had against the Montreal Alouettes with a stronger offensive line in front of Jeremiah Masoli and a quarterback that's really, really feeling it, who's able to get the ball away quickly. And that's the other thing is Jeremiah Masoli doesn't sit around in the pocket. He finds his target quickly, which means the DBs have to be sharp and the defensive line has to be fast. Yeah,
so the question is then, the defense has to be good. They need at least, how many touchdowns do they need combined from defense and special teams to win this game?
I think they probably need,
or at least turnovers that lead to very good field position for the offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think they need at least a touchdown from either special teams or defense, at least one.
Yeah.
And that would have won them the game against the Alouettes if they would have had one. I think they need at least one, and I think the offense needs to get its crap together. It's poop in a group, as I like to say, because the defense, like I said, the defense can't do everything, and so they need to figure out how to get the ball out of Brandon Bridges' hands faster.
And that's something that I noticed that in that Toronto game that they did well week 1 was Zach Collaros. He did 3-step drop, fast out, boom, 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 and all of a sudden after that the plays started to extend longer, or they recognized in game 1 that, okay, Zach doesn't have a lot of time, let's design the offense around that. And that's kind of disappeared since then.
And it's so interesting to know that, because that was really the type of game that Kevin Glenn played in the Steve McAdoo offense that was so successful, was that it got the ball away quickly. And all of Kevin Glenn's best games were in games where he was able to get the ball away quickly. And so I don't know if that's Brandon Bridges' MO, really. He's still a little bit deer in headlights to me in some regards. Yeah. I think he panics a little too quickly sometimes. I think he's in his own head a little bit too much sometimes. But I don't think that that's something that's not fixable.
No.
I think that he needs to be given the opportunity to fix it on his own, though.
And that comes back, and that's also a confidence issue, because right now the coach doesn't have any confidence in him.
And how do you feel going into a game wondering all the time if you're going to be pulled for making a mistake?
It all reverts. Remember, it reverts back to Corey Chamberlain when he used to Anthony Allen and the running backs. Every fumble, he was switching the running back, and it just snowballed and it snowballed, and it got worse. And eventually, it's like, give someone a chance. They're clearly, all of them are mentally fragile over this right now. Stop it.
And I think you have to treat, in a lot of ways, like you treat your quarterback like you would treat a starting pitcher, like you treat a goaltender. These are guys that need to know they're the guy.
Yeah.
You can't screw around with them too much, or it just shatters them, because everything is on their back.
Unless you're Kevin Glenn, nothing shatters him.
Well, nothing shatters Kevin Glenn. Oh, I miss Kevin Glenn. Those were the simpler times.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit now. We'll talk about one of Kevin Glenn's former teams, which is all of them. All of them. First
off, were we already talking about one of Kevin?
Yeah, we were. We were as well. Yeah. 2 of them actually. And that's the news today. We're recording on Tuesday night. The day that the news out of Winnipeg that Matt Nichols has, I think in some circles, at least when my talks with John Hodge, it seems a little surprising that he's actually off the 6-game injured list a little early.
Is it surprising? Because I thought that they had said early on that about 4 weeks was what they anticipated, that it wouldn't be that much longer.
The vibe I got from John anyway was that he thought maybe it was going to be longer.
Oh,
now, you never know how a knee's going to react anyway, but because he obviously has to be better, because this doesn't feel like a panic move because the Bombers are 0-3.
No,
they've played fairly well. Yes, they've lost 2 games, but they still played fairly well with Strevler at quarterback. So this clearly isn't a panic move. Clearly, he's ready. And this, to me, because this really shifts the dynamic in the West a little bit. It's kind of been Calgary and everyone else. But I think with their group of Canadians, with hopefully a defense that can get it going, if Richie Hall can ever get his act together there again, it shifts the dynamic in the West, because I think Matt Nichols at quarterback, no offense to Strevler, puts Winnipeg in that upper echelon this year.
And I mean, I was talking about Winnipeg as probably one of the top 2 teams in the West. I mean, it's hard to say that when you have Calgary and Edmonton in the West, but I mean, I felt like they made the upgrades that they needed to make. They kept the pieces that they needed to keep in order to maybe make the jump. And it's always hard to make the jump in the West.
Yeah, 100.
I mean, but Matt Nichols is that quarterback that you put in the conversation with Mike Riley and with Bo Levi Mitchell. He has given them such a boost in that position that I feel like it's fair to say that. And so for him to come off is big for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to have him back. They found a serviceable backup in Strevler, and that's good because they didn't know what they were going to have without Darian Durant.
They haven't found a quarterback in like a decade. So, I mean, just to find someone that has potential is huge news in Winnipeg. Now to have 2 quarterbacks, Bomber fans must be feeling like they've died and gone to heaven or something.
Yeah, because so you're right. I mean, this does change the dynamic in the West that he's able to come back as soon as he has, and it really puts them back into the mix as far as contenders in the West and as far as going for a playoff spot. I think it's great for Bomber fans. It'll be interesting. It was a closed practice in Winnipeg today, so no one really knows what's going on. So it'll be interesting.
Which Mike O'Shea doesn't do very often.
So they must have known something was up.
Yeah.
Very interesting because we have one a week here in Saskatchewan. No, so I always know something's up when they on that day, usually in Riderville as well. Yeah. Though there's always kind of something up in Riderville. But it will be interesting to see if he's been pulled off and they're still going to play Strevler on Saturday, or if he's been pulled off to play. And I assume because they have a long week and the game's on Saturday that Matt Nichols is probably going to play.
I don't think there's any point in taking him off and not playing him. If you're going to count his whole salary now, you might as well play him.
Yeah, that's probably right.
So, and the other interesting story in the CFL this week was the fact that Kyries Heber finally got suspended. This guy has been he's been dirty his entire career. He's been fined so many times.
Question for you.
Yeah.
What does it take in the CFL to get a 2-game suspension?
Well,
that's what
it's a fair question. I understand why a lot of people were wondering why it wasn't more, but I think you have to look at it from kind of the, for lack of a better term, legal perspective, where he's been fined so many times. He's been max fined. I'm probably overstating how many times he's been fined, but
yeah.
And then if they go from max fine to say a 3-game suspension, they probably win down to appeal to 1 pretty easily, the CFLPA, because there was no precedent set where no, you didn't give him the 1-game suspension first. So to me, that's what that looks like now. Kyries Heber should have been suspended 2 or 3 times over by now, so then he could have easily got that multi-game suspension. But I don't think the precedent was there, not only for him, but really across the league.
That hit to me was so egregious.
Oh, it is one of the worst hits I've ever seen. It feels
like it should have been, just for the egregiousness of the hit, it was worth an extra game.
Oh, I don't disagree. It's how, unfortunately, the process has to work. And it's also maybe kind of NHL-ish in the fact that if... I'm blanking on who actually got hit.
Me too.
Anyway, I guess if the Calgary receiver was actually injured on the play, that might have played into it as well, because we know the NHL loves to base their suspensions on the outcome of the hit, of a situation, rather than the act itself. So I think if there was an injury on the play, that might have made a difference as well.
Yeah, and it shouldn't. It
definitely should not.
But I just feel like this is an area where the CFL doesn't make waves, doesn't go out of its way to make waves, when in certain cases it should just be the long arm of the law. Football is a dangerous enough game on its own when it's played legally. And so when it's not played legally, when it's played dangerously, they should be putting down the big hand of God and saying, you can't play the game like this. No. This is what gives football a bad name. This is what injures people. This is what changes their lives irrevocably. Yeah. And I've always had an issue with how light they go on some of the most dangerous things that you can do in the sport. Yeah, and it was that's why I honestly, given their track record, didn't expect them to actually get suspended. And it goes back to some other things that happened in the league earlier this year, what I didn't think it was going to happen, because there was that hit that Henoch Mwamba admitted that he went purposely at Johnny Manziel. He came out in the media and said he did it on purpose, that basically to try to take out Johnny Manziel, and the league did nothing about it. He did get fined, the max fine, the week after. Yeah, well, but he didn't get fined for whatever. No, it's very interesting, and that was a weird one because Enoch Mwamba is not like that.
Well, this year apparently he is.
Apparently he is. Maybe you would be too if you were playing in Montreal.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
At Kroger Pharmacy, care is what's most convenient for you. Care is being here when you need us. We're open evenings and weekends. Care is helping you save more. Most insurance plans and discount cards are accepted at your local Kroger Pharmacy. Care is saving you time by managing your prescriptions online. You can request refills, check order status, and more. Care is convenience that works for everyone. Kroger Health, a world of care is in store. Services and availability vary by location. Age and other restrictions may apply. For coverage, consult your health insurance company. Visit the pharmacy or our site for details. When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.